Rainwater Killer, a Haunted Library exclusive series.
I don't know, I'd say I got to flushing around 12 a.m., Keene said, leaning back in his seat across from my desk. We had both been out of the hospital a few days now, and though we were nursing sore bodies and bruised egos, we were thankful to be alive. This was an official interview concerning his abduction the night he had been surveying Larson's residence. A tape recorder was capturing the conversation. I pulled up about, I'd say 100 yards from his house maybe. There's that hill that leads down to the cul-de-sac he lives in. I parked just up from there, my car facing his house. And of course, we know that Keene was not home, I added. When Sheriff Lutz and I were pursuing you and your abductor, we had a call about Larson's patrol car, spotted within the vicinity. But I can safely say that he wasn't at home in the time you were performing the surveillance. Keene nodded, crossing his legs. Well, I sat there for about 30 minutes, enjoying the rain. I had my phone out. I was watching some dark detective story on YouTube, and then I heard a noise coming from the back seat. You hadn't heard anything else up to that point that might have alarmed you that something wasn't right in your car? He shook his head, lost in thought, his mind going back to last week. I imagined how scary that could have been, having somebody pop up from the shadows of the back seat of your car, especially at night. Not a thing, he finally answered. I hadn't saw anything when I opened my door to get in. Had I been parked in the garage lights would have probably illuminated the back seat. But I was parked in the driveway. Like any other night, I just got in, hit the ignition, and I was off. I didn't look in the back seat of the car. Well, that makes sense, I said, shrugging. I don't know of many people that perform a check of their back seats at night when they get in their vehicles. Most people lock their car doors, right? These days anyhow, so you assume you're alone when you get into that vehicle. I'll be checking the back seat every single time I get in the vehicle from now on, he said grimly, for the rest of my life. The man in front of me was traumatized. Considering his extensive history as a police officer before he had gotten to private investigation, this spoke volumes of just how scary this maniac was and his ability to get under all of our skin. But he had allowed Keene to live, and I was still trying to figure out why exactly. And Keene wasn't the first person's life that he had spared. Then I heard the noise. I had a split second to wonder if that noise come from outside the car or inside. Turns out it was him shuffling up, and the seat choked me out. I waited for him to continue. The more the story he relived, the harder it was becoming for him to get the words out. Next thing I know, I woke up with him carrying me over his shoulder through a field. I remember my chest hurting because I had been deprived of air. I started coughing. I guess I thought I was still being choked. It's scary stuff, Frank. How much do you weigh again? I asked him. I already knew that he was a big man. I'm still well over 220 pounds, probably close to 250. How fast was he moving? I mean, when he was carrying you? It was as if he didn't have much on his shoulders, to be honest, like I was just some heavy toddler. I could feel the muscles in his shoulders working. I was manhandled, and the guy was thinner than me, and I could tell he was just generally a smaller man. He must have been world-class shape. It was the strength of a power lifter in a lean frame to lift a guy like me as big as I am and keep a steady pace through that field for more than, what I'd say, 2 or 3 minutes. I wouldn't know anybody that could do that. This kind of strength had been evident from the very beginning, even in the Noble's death in the mountains of Oklahoma. The stealthy way he had captured Nobles without his wife immediately realizing, and then the way he had hoisted Nobles up from the tree and gutted him. Then I remember being dropped on the ground. I went to my knees. I was too weak to stand. I guess that gave him a good angle to kick me, which he did, in the stomach and ribs. The air was knocked out of me, what little I had left. I was just there on the ground on all fours, like some elementary kid who had just gotten punched in the stomach in his first schoolyard fight, gasping for air, feeling like I was going to die. Then I got hoisted up and was tied to a tree. Next thing I know, I saw the squad cars pull up from the road. That's when I could tell I had been carried through the field. And then the gunfire came, but I knew it wasn't you all because it was semi-automatic. I watched and listened as you guys got ambushed, basically. I never saw them out in the field actually shooting. It was too dark. I just heard the windows of the cars shatter and the bullets, ping the cars and all that. But the rest is history. I wound up passing out from the shock and I went limp right there on the tree. I didn't wake up until I was in the ambulance. I turned off the tape recorder. That was enough for now. And today was our second recorded account of that night anyways. I felt like I'd had enough should we need it. "How's Lutz?" he asked. "Oh, man. I didn't even know anything was wrong with him until he came and saw me the night we were admitted. I mean, he seemed a little tired and groggy in the car when we were on our way to you, but he had just woken up. But later that night at the hospital, when he had walked out of the room to go to the ER area, it took me like 10 minutes to talk him into going down there because he thought he had rabies. That's when he started acting bizarre." Keen shook his head in disbelief. "The only time I've ever thought of rabies was in the movie Cujo, After that, you just kind of get a rabies shot if you need it and you forget about it. I wasn't aware it was that deadly in humans. From the research that I've done and the doctors I've spoken to, if it's not treated within the first 2 to 3 weeks, you have a 99% chance of dying. You should see some of the videos I dug up on YouTube of humans who have rabies. Of course, most of these videos are all third world countries, but it's horrifying to see it. It's almost like you're possessed. I couldn't think of a crueler way to die. There's no cure at those advanced stages. You basically suffer until you fall into that coma." "It couldn't have happened to a better man," Keen said. "Agreed. I'm going to lose a good friend, it looks like." "How was our guy able to do this?" he asked. "Are you sure this isn't coincidental and he just didn't get bit within the last few months and simply failed to get the shot after?" I postured up in the chair. My office window was open. It was early November. The day was nice but cloudy, and it had just started to rain. The droplets pinged the ground and the window pane, causing me and Keen to look outside far longer than 2 adult males ever should just when it rains. "No," I said finally, keeping my eyes on the window beyond. "Doctors confirmed it. It was without a doubt the bite he suffered the day I went into the woods behind the track, and he had come with me. I didn't even know that he had been bit until he walked in the hospital room and told me. Apparently, he hasn't been feeling well for the last week. Flu-like symptoms, which is normal. Rabies attacks the central nervous system, causing all kinds of shit to send your brain and body into turmoil. Ultimately, in the end, causing your brain to swell and send you into that coma and then death." "Jesus Christ," Keen muttered. "There's 2 types of rabies in humans from what I've learned. One type is called furious rabies. Now this would cause a person to react or suffer similar to the ways of the dog in the movie you mentioned, Cujo. Uncontrolled sudden hyperactivity, erratic behavior, insomnia, hallucinations, excessive salivation and spitting, and uncontrolled anger and aggression, eventually convulsions, and again, coma and death." Keen opened his eyes wide. "So Lutz has furious rabies, pretty much the worst kind you can get. The other type is just as deadly, but it seems to be less symptomatic. It's called paralytic rabies. Basically, you become paralyzed starting at the site of the bite, and then coma follows soon after. We're talking about a period of about 14 days on each of these diseases after you start experiencing symptoms." So back to my question. How was he able to do this? How do you release a supposed bat and guide it towards a person? Well, I spoke with a wildlife official from the New York State Department of Health. Apparently, this is the first case of rabies in the state in 50 years, mostly because it's city and bats, which is a big factor at transmitting the disease, are only found in the remote regions of the state. He told me that if a person would somehow be able to capture a wild bat with rabies, which would be a feat all on its own without being bitten yourself, right? If that person knew the trajectory of flights that bats take once released from captivity, that bat would most likely bite the first large living warm-blooded thing it came into contact with. In this case, it was John. Unfortunately, he's old, tough, and stubborn. He didn't go see a doctor for the proper vaccinations in that 10 to 20 day time period. "This is something out of a horror movie," Keen said. "It's bad enough we have to deal with this guy killing people randomly in the rain. Now there's bats and John is sick with rabies. I almost died." "My life has been a horror movie since I've been up here," I replied. Listen, I want you to lay low for the next few days. Get some rest. Then let's regroup on Wednesday. I have a mission for you. Come back and see me on Wednesday." Keen nodded and stood. "You get some rest too, Frank. I'll see you Sunday." I stood, closed the window, and grabbed my jacket. I was soon off to meet Lutz. We had agreed to meet at a facility that housed records and older police files, some of these being cold cases. I wanted to look for some files on past serial killers from other states. Two in particular, the Zodiac case and the Golden State Killer, who had recently been apprehended. I wanted to compare motives and case details, because the Rainwater Killer had similar motives to these two killers, especially in the sense of the Zodiac, who had sent letters to taunt police, as our man was still sending tiny vials of rainwater from each of these killings. The New York City Federal Building was a unique 5,000 square foot, two-level building that kept case files from cold cases, unsolved local crimes, and unsolved crimes outside of New York dating back to 1950. It was kind of similar to a modern-day library, with rows and rows of shelves that were tall, loaded with binders, files, and audio tapes. The second level was much the same, with a few desks and laptops. A lot of police stations around the country would call us to look up some crimes that had happened in their own state, but it turned out we had filed more information on it than they had. I had never known about the NYCFB until I came up here for the case. I pulled up to the parking lot a little after 4. It was still raining. Still incredibly sore from the assault, I made a slow walk to Lutz's car. He had just pulled up as well. The parking lot was empty, and it looked like we had the place to ourselves. I walked up to his SUV as he killed the engine. The rain was beginning to come down harder. Though Lutz was in his final stages of the rabies disease, doctors had cleared him to be free on his own condolences, but had recommended that he stay in the hospital or at least be supervised. I had spoken to him on the phone this morning, and his speech was very slurred, yet he sounded hyperactive at the same time. It was gut-wrenching to listen to. He rolled down his window. His face looked pale and he appeared exhausted. Again, severe insomnia is a symptom of rabies in humans. "How you feeling, man?" "Like $1,000,000, he said with a smile, but it wasn't the smile I knew from him. It was a quirky, crooked, fake smile. "Come on," I said, ushering him out, opening the door. "Let's get inside before it pours on us." He got out slowly and I shut the door for him. Once inside, I was again reminded just how gloomy this building was. It was old. Today was just the second time I had ever been in here. "Is everything okay?" I asked as we walked towards the aisles of info. "No, not really. I haven't slept much. Muscle spasms, brain shocks. My mind is racing, and I feel like I have the flu. Other than that, I'm good." "Is there nothing they have given you that can alleviate some of these symptoms?" I asked, stopping to look at him. He kept walking as I stood there. He finally muttered, "It's too late for any of that, Frankie. They say I don't have long. Half a month." I noticed he kind of growled the last part out. What was I going to do? Tell the guy to go home and live out the rest of his life in isolation? Or in a hospital? Rabies is a cruel disease in humans, as it is in pets and wild animals. And Lutz deserved to do what he pleased in his last few days on this planet. I finally caught up with him. "I'm going to go over to Rosie and look at some of the Zodiac case files. I still think a lot of our guy's MO is similar to that of the Zodiac." His face was blank, like it had been in the hospital. My heart went out to this man. I tried to overcome my emotions. I had been through so much in the past 3 months since arriving in New York. "I'm going to rest a second," he muttered, taking a seat at the lone small round table that sat just before the 34 aisles of files. "Okay, man, sounds good. Holler at me if you need me." I studied some cases from the Zodiac from 69 to 70, primarily the files on the letter sending. I wanted to gain a better insight on why the Zodiac may have done that, aside from pure theatrics and attention. Well, 30 minutes had passed, and I had noticed that Lutz had not joined me. In fact, I hadn't heard him in the other rows at all either. Fearing that he had passed out where he sat, I closed the folder and brought it with me to check on him. I walked out of the aisle and looked around. "John? John! Where you at, man?" There was no answer. Maybe it went to the bathroom. That's when the lights went out. Luckily, I had my pocket mag light, and I flipped it on. John? Come on, man. Turn the lights back on. If you aren't feeling well, let's go to the hospital. We don't have to be here right now. John! John, turn the lights on. There was a deafening silence. The traffic outside seemed to even stop. I shined the light in my immediate area and didn't see him. I assumed he was delusional, and I probably needed to get him out of here. I guess this hadn't been a good idea after all. Back here, Frankie. I jumped and turned. His voice had come from behind me, in the rows I was just in. John, damn it. Not cool. Not cool, man. Come on, let's go. Let's get you out of here. I shined the light down the row I had been in as I walked that direction. At the end of that aisle, there he was, just standing there, staring back into my light, his eyes fogged over. He spit a gob of saliva on the floor. John, come on, man. Let's go. You're not feeling well. Let's get you to the hospital. Maybe they can do something for you. Don't give up. He disappeared behind the shelf as a cold fear coursed through me. Goose flesh pricked my arms and face. He was completely delusional. The rabies now in full control. He had no business not being quarantined to a hospital at this point. I backed up a few steps. I felt for my .44. It was there, but I had to make sure. John, I don't want to hurt you. Come on, man. We've been through a lot. Come on out. This isn't you. Damn it, Frank, if we caught this bastard, this wouldn't be happening. Now look at me. Look at me! He was now behind me. Somehow he had circled me silently in the darkness. I twisted, every fine hair on my body erect. John, back up. Stay back. He was inching closer, but he wasn't moving his arms as he walked. What I mean is, his arms just hung to his sides as he walked. His body was stiff from up top. Imagine a person running a full sprint with their arms at their sides and their body straight up. I knew that there was a small chance that if he was to bite me, that I could be infected. It occurred to me that there was no reasoning with him at this point, because this John was no longer the John I knew. He was 100% rabid now. I just needed to stay out of his way and get out of here unscathed. But his back was now to the front doors as he had circled me somehow in the darkness, and my cell phone was in the car. Just get over here, I want to talk! John, stay back, I warned, keeping the light on his face. He was about 10 feet away. I was still backing up. He was still advancing. Saliva dropped from his mouth, and he looked like he was drenched in sweat. Come on, Frank! Damn you! We gotta get this guy! I decided to take off into a sprint down one of the aisles. I turned at the end of the aisle to see John standing where I had been just a few seconds ago, a malevolent grin on his face. He walked forward, arms again at his sides dangling, his body up top stiff and straight. He violently tossed over a shelf. Books, folders, notebooks went everywhere on the floor. I moved to the next aisle. If he was to run down the aisle, I could simply run down the next one and beat him to the exit. But he wasn't doing this. He slowly began to bang his head on the shelf, over and over, his shoulders and neck stiff with the sway of his head. It was a disturbing and extremely scary scene. Then his head began to fly into the metal shelf with force. My heart rate increased and my eyes got wide as I watched in horror. Why don't you just put me out of my misery, Frankie? I pulled my gun, keeping the light on him. His forehead was bleeding profusely from the force of the headbutts against the metal. He was still salivating at the mouth. He was, in every sense, a true-life zombie that seemed to be possessed by a demonic spirit. And I was alone with him in a big, dark building. John, don't come any closer. He moved over to the next aisle, causing me to have to move to follow his movement. On that aisle, he began to walk towards me slowly, those arms hanging like dead tree limbs, his upper body impossibly stiff with his movement. I lifted my gun.
Shoot me, Frank!
John, damn it, stop right there! He continued his momentum and closed within 8 feet. He opened his mouth wide like a wild animal and lunged forward. The .44 Magnum blew a hole in his chest the size of a tennis ball. Blood poured to the floor. He clutched his chest and went down to one knee. I stood there in disbelief, wondering why he wasn't flat on his back dead. He stood again and bolted for me. I stood my ground and fired again. He wailed on the ground. This time the bullet took the top of his left forehead off. Blood spattered on me and the surrounding area. He finally flopped to the ground. Breathing heavy, I was going to be sick. There was no way around it. The adrenaline, his nightmarish condition, and the fact I had just shot my newest best friend was all too much. So up it came, and when I was done puking, I wiped my mouth. Still breathless, I bent down and checked his neck for a pulse. There was none. Oh, shit. Dear God in heaven, God bless. John rose, his torso and all his upper half, just as stiff as you'd seen any boogeyman in a horror film set up after he'd just been shot. No hands or arms were used in this movement. It was uncanny and completely fueled by sheer superhuman adrenaline caused by the virus. I jumped back and lifted my gun, firing again, this time the .44 Magnum nearly decapitating him. The third shot seemed to echo through the building more than the first two. He flopped back down, his head bouncing off the cold concrete floor. I checked his pulse again, and then I checked it again, and I checked it one last time just to make sure. I didn't have the energy to move, so I just sat there again in a state of shock, worse than a week ago during the machine gun assault, and I quietly wept as John Lutz took his last breath.